Alrighty, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get things started. So appreciate everybody tuning in this morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you guys might be. First off, I just want to say thank you for joining and welcome back if you've been listening in on our other webinars, and welcome if this is the first time that you've joined us. If you're not familiar with the format, we're going to have two presenters here. Adam Douglas is first off. He represents Hockey Canada as well as Catapult Sports. And we will have him followed by Pierre Allard, and he represents Montreal Canadiens. They're both going to talk about ice hockey and how they're using wearable data and most importantly, practical applications in the field. In addition, we encourage everybody to ask questions. I'll ask Adam and Pierre at the end of their presentation a few questions from the audience. So if you scroll down on the bottom of that panel on Zoom, you'll be able to see Q&A section. You'll be able to type out whatever questions you might have, and feel free to send them my way. At the end of about 10 minutes prior to wrapping up, I'll put out a poll just to get some feedback from the audience and how you like the presentations and anything we could do to tweak them. So that's kind of the format here. I expect it to be about an hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes in total. But obviously, if we get a lot of questions, we will do our best to answer all of them. So first up, I wanted to introduce Adam Douglas, who's able to join us today. And he, like I mentioned previously, represents Hockey Canada. He's been there for about 10 years now. And in addition, works at Catapult Sports with myself as a applied sports scientist. He really has a strong expertise in hockey. Recently got his doctorate degree at York University in kinesiology and exercise science, and really understands the constraints of ice hockey and what works in a real world environment and what doesn't. So he's really going to shed some light onto that and using data to enhance performance in ice hockey. So welcome, Adam.
Thanks very much, Cal. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for taking time today to join in, and hopefully the information Pierre and I will share will resonate with a lot of you. And one of the things I really tried to do when I was putting my presentation together is really show how I've used our wearable data with Hockey Canada, and some of the discussions we've had with coaches, for better or for worse, regarding the information and how we've been able to implement and utilize and really action off that data. So I'm really excited to share some of this with you over the next 30 to 40 minutes, and really kind of dive into what I do. And Cal mentioned it really briefly, but I think it's important to note that I kind of straddle two worlds. I work with Catapult Sports. I work with all of our ice hockey clients, overseeing their data, their information, helping them better understand the data. But I'm also an applied practitioner. I hold the title of Manager Sport Performance with Hockey Canada as well. And in that role, I oversee our men's and women's kind of physical preparation of our national team programs. And I work really closely now with our World Junior team, our under 20 team. And that's going to kind of frame the back half of my presentation. It is how we've been able to utilize our wearable technology and data with a tournament-based structure within that team. And one of the challenges I have is I get a brand new coaching staff every year. So how can I frame the information of the lessons we've learned from previous years? There's three things I'm going to really touch upon today as I talk about my journey using wearable technology. The first one was the question I always need to ask myself when we launched into this is what technology is out there, and is it valid and reliable? And that should be the cornerstone for anybody's technology integration within their team or their sport. I'm going to talk about data collection versus data action and how to really get buy-in from key stakeholders. And key stakeholders in hockey, in my opinion, are coaches, management, other support staff members, and most importantly, players. And then lastly, I'm going to talk you through how we make those decisions on a daily basis, and how we've been able to really integrate our wearable technology for monitoring practices and games on the ice into our daily training environment and actioning off those decisions. So just a little bit of information at Hockey Canada with the World Juniors. We use our T6 unit which is what you see here. It's a combination of an accelerometer, a magnetometer, and a gyroscope. And really, this is what 90% of our ice hockey clients use over here in North America. And really, the key features here are that our inertial data, which is our accelerometer and IMA data, samples at 100 hertz. And then our LPS, which is our local positioning system, or the kind of indoor satellites called Clear Sky, they sample at 10 hertz. And one of the questions, I always get asked is, is that enough? You'll see technology, we'll talk, they sample at 20 hertz, 1,000 hertz. And really, it needs to be enough to identify the demands of the sport. But more importantly, it needs to be valid and reliable. And Hockey Canada started down this path over 5 years ago with Catapult. And this anchored all of our decisions. And really, the place that you go to really start to dig into the information surrounding the technology is the peer-reviewed literature. And for me, that was where I started looking. And there's lots of papers out there, lots of scientists have studied, the S5s and the T6 units and our Clear Sky system. And really, I have confidence in the system, not just because I work for them, but because I'm a user in it, in that there's a lot of smart people that have led research studies and research projects surrounding the validity and reliability. So here's just a few I wanted to highlight. When we talk about our inertial or our LPS system, our indoor system, Vicon motion capture is the gold standard. And here's, some work done that says, yes, the ultra wideband positioning system, the Catapult Clear Sky system, has an acceptable validity compared to Vicon, the gold standard. Third-party independent testing is important as well. Here you can see some results from Victoria University, and actually FIFA, as a governing sport body, tested the wearable technology that they were allowing their teams to use. And you can see from our velocity and positional data, we were well above the standard that the FIFA rating used. So for me, as a practitioner, I can hang my hat that there's certainly smart people out there that have tested these and put in the technology through the rigors. Now, from a hockey perspective, this was the paper when it got released back in 2016, 2017, that really kind of solidified that, yes, this technology can start to identify some of the different movement patterns from the sport of ice hockey. We all know that ice hockey, the movement patterns and what happens on the ice is different than running. And so it was important to me that we weren't just taking a technology that people said, yes, you can take it for a soccer team and put it on a hockey player, because I know the movement demands and movement patterns, what happens on the ice with the glide versus just running based gate systems. It was different. And, when we talk about reliability, we want to make sure that what we're measuring matters, and it's giving us clean and consistent measurement over time. So this was a big paper by the group at University of Minnesota that basically said, yes, we feel that the player load or the accelerometry inertial data coming out from Catapult was reliable. So for me, as a sports scientist, as a practitioner, I can now have confidence that the information we're going to be measuring on the ice is true, and it'll be true from practice to practice. One of the things we always talk about is making sure the athletes keep the units every day to help some unit reliability. But now that we know that the units we're using are valid and reliable, now it comes down to what are they actually measuring. And these are some of the simple slides I use when I present to coaches, because they understand the athlete wears the unit between their shoulder pads, either in a compressive garment pouch, or some of our teams sew pouches onto the back plate of their shoulder blades. With Hockey Canada, we use the garment, just because I'll only have players for 6 weeks or so. We're not going to sew pouches onto their back plate, but they'll wear the garment. And really, through the combination of the accelerometer, gyroscope, and magnetometer, these are the things we can measure. We can measure force, body position, and direction. And these are our inertial sensors. that a lot. I mean, the hardwired install of essentially anchors or indoor satellites that can tell us positional data, velocity, accelerations, and decelerations. We were fortunate at the tournament in 2019 that we were able to get some positional data, positional game data from our World Junior program. And I've actually put out a paper looking at some of the speed thresholds and trying to really decipher what's actually happening from a speed-based perspective. I'll post that citation at the end of my presentation so people can check it out. But this is kind of the future now. We're starting to push into getting an even further understanding of what's actually happening when players are practicing and when they're on the ice. Because for me, as a sports scientist, it's really important for me to understand what Catapult is measuring and how I can best use that to help our players and help our team. So I break down the hundreds of metrics that Catapult has, and here's just a small sampling. But I want to look at things from a volume perspective. How much work was being done? I want to look at the intensity. So, how hard was the work? And then one of the nice things about hockey and the stride algorithm that we have is we can look at asymmetry work. So we can look at individual average force per stride left and right, and we can track that over time. And there's been times where I've used that from a rehab perspective and trying to get athletes back to their baseline and back to the normal. Now, one of the things I always caution when we talk about asymmetry is the understanding that hockey is an asymmetrical sport. So it's not about getting balance back to a player, it's getting them as close to whatever their norm asymmetry was. And that's one of the nice pieces of this asymmetry is we can kind of fingerprint athletes and then start to monitor any deviations from those normals. So that's just a nice kind of overview of kind of the technology and some of my thought process when I was first starting. Is it valid and reliable? What am I actually going to dial in to monitor? But let's start talking about hockey. So let's talk about how Hockey Canada uses that information and how you guys can start to think about how you might be able to utilize some wearable technology, whatever it is, within it. Now, one of the things with hockey is we are a traditions-based sport. We are driven a lot by authority, meaning our GMs or coaches, and a lot of it's been around a long time, so that's how we've always done it. And one of the things I always kind of challenge a lot of our head coaches is, why are we doing things? Why do we pregame skate? Well, we've always pregame skated. Well, that as a sports scientist, that's not a good enough answer. As a applied practitioner, that's not a good enough answer to me. I want to start to challenge things a little bit. And I will tell you, this is going to be the number one hurdle for a lot of people when they bring in new, fresh ideas, is how do you overcome the we've always done it this way thinking. So here's kind of how I've done it. So for me, when I talk about successful buy-in, there's 3 layers I need to target as a practitioner to make sure we're going to have a smooth understanding and a smooth implementation of this information. So obviously, coaches and management, they not only control the money and the finances for technology, but also the buck stops with them from an ideas and integration perspective. I talk a lot about, widening the base. So a lot of times Catapult or technology can just live within the performance world. So the strength and conditioning coach, sports scientist, you need to get out of that and you need to help organizational buy-in by integrating your therapy program, showing them how it can be used in a return to play rehab perspective, showing some of that asymmetry data and having those open conversations amongst that backroom staff. And then lastly, there's got to be a way to get it to the players and athletes. That is one of the easier points of entry, especially in this day and age. And I call it the gamification of the sport. Athletes love numbers. They love technology. They live with technology now. So by showing some athletes, how fast they skated, or what their max velocity was, or their certain distance at a max velocity, or how, hard they worked. One of the things I use that I'm going to touch on later is high intensity work duration. So how much work did you accumulate above a certain threshold? And athletes love that. We've had great success using almost like a leaderboard standpoint, because who doesn't love seeing a number one beside their name? But from a true performance integration, this is where we need to overcome. We need to work on somehow getting the information into the hands of coaches, get them start questioning both the information and how they can use that information. And, I liken it to teaching an old dog new tricks. So this is Dale Hunter. Dale Hunter was the head coach of our national junior team this year. I have to say, personally, I was really excited when he was named coach, because he's a legend. I never had the opportunity to work with him before, but you can see he's had quite a storied career, both as a player and a coach. Dale has been tagged an old school coach by a lot of people, and I think it's just by the way he played and his demeanor and everything. But I have to say, he came into the Hockey Canada system with such a growth mindset. It was unbelievable. He was a pleasure to work with, because at the end of the day, he wanted to make his team better. How could he be a better coach to put his players in the best position to succeed? And I'm going to show you a few slides next that I presented to our coaching staff last summer about the kind of how we can use that wearable technology. And it would have been very easy for someone who's, coached over 1,300 games to say, no, I'm going to do it my way. I don't care kind of what you say. But Dale really took that information and really looked at it from a coaching lens. But more importantly, I need to do whatever I can from behind the bench as the head coach to make our team better. And so from a Hockey Canada perspective, we talk about these pillars of performance. And, for me, they're not separate. They're not siloed. The way they intertwine is what leads us to our world championship success. And from a physical perspective, I'm just going to drop the mental here. It's how can I sell this information, or how can I get our coaches understanding what they're looking at? Well, for me, you need to be able to talk coach, and you need to be able to layer that information into how they're going to understand it. So coaches are the kings and the masters of the technical tactical preparation. This isn't anything they don't already do. But for me, it's okay, here's how we can look at this. Well, from a pure physical pillar perspective, we look at player health and availability. By measuring practice and game demands, we can make sure their physical capacities are where we need them to succeed at the international level. Now, as we start to overlay our technical and tactical work, we start looking at skill execution at maximum intensity, development of hockey-specific physical conditioning. Dale can do his practices, and the coaches can do their practices, and then we can measure it and say, was that at the level of our international success, or how close to game day or match day demands did we have? And then finally, as we start to overlay that with the tactical, that's what I call true performance integration. And how can we get there? Well, in the best kind of situations I've had with both our men's and women's programs is actually showing the coaches. So to shift their mindset, I'm not just going to sit there in a meeting and say, well, I think you should change your practices, or have you thought about the drill selection? You don't have a leg to stand on, especially over here in North America hockey. You will get, pushed out of the room as quickly as you can. But if we start showing them some of the true practice information and just how far off some of our game data we are, we can start to ask, how can we close that gap? And this was the biggest breakthrough I've ever had with our men's and women's coaches, is I just showed them that our practice plans underexpose players to intensity. In this game, day and age, and in this game, everybody wants to play fast. Everybody wants intensity. Everybody wants to push the pace. And we know intensity is important, but actually showing the coaches this information was almost like a light bulb going off for them. And it's not them questioning, their 10, 15 plus years of coaching. What it is just saying, that's not the outcome I wanted. How can we be better? And so when I talk about our coaches, I talk about it, intensity matters. And I want to remove the thinking of volume. And that's where kind of hockey and we found ourselves stuck was, our coaches thought we needed to practice a lot to get our players ready. Some of our teams would do, a 2-hour practice in the morning and then come back late afternoon and do another hour to 75 minutes of practice every day during our pre-competition period or for the first 3 or 4 days. And I'm really just challenged our coaches to think less about volume and more about intensity. There's periods of time where we need to do a lot of work and you need to coach and you need to install that tech tack, but really, can we accomplish those tech tack goals at or near game intensity? And that's where, I've been able to have success with coaches shifting the mindset of focusing on that intensity. And one of the things I like to use, and you got to stroke the head coach's ego a little bit. I say, you are the coaching expert. You are the one who has, the years of coaching experience. I'm sure you could prepare a team if you had 3 60-minute practices versus, 3 80-minute practices. Is that 20 minutes a day actually going to make a difference? And they're like, well, I could do more video or I could do that. You just got to stroke them and say, oh, you're the expert. I'm sure you could, we could just chop a little bit of practice time and add it there. And obviously, where a lot of people in sport are ego driven, but that's one of the ways I've found is just, kind of working with them within their medium and really dialing into that kind of open sharing of the wearable data. Now, let's talk about how we use that information now. So we have the coach on board. I've had success with coaches getting on board. I've also had failures with getting coaches on board. And really the process that I go through behind the scenes is the same. I'll make suggestions and recommendations. I will follow that up with the information. And then if they want to engage in a discussion from it, great. Chances are if I've had failures, they're not wanting to talk about it. And I say, that's fine. I'm just going to keep, providing you the information. If we ever get into a situation where we need to action off it, we have that information. And typically assistant coaches will engage, but if you do run into a true old school head coach, then there's, other strategies you have, but it doesn't change what I do as a support staff member. But really, one of the things I try to do is I try to work with our coaches to build a monthly plan. So, we start with that blank schedule that I showed you, and then we come into, how can we best plan and prepare our players? Now, a lot of this is based off, my experience and some of the research, and we've monitored over 3,000 practices over the last 5 years. For me, it's about intensity, and I want to ramp. So I try to start with our days off. When do we think our days off will be? Then we want to ramp into games. So you'll see here, for example, December 25th, we suggested a low volume, high intensity practice day before a game. We're not out there long, but I want to challenge our players to have, to be skating at or near game intensity for a brief period of time. And one of the analogies I always use is I want our athletes to be able to, climb the mountain. And so I want to get them kind of towards that summit or towards that peak the day before versus them starting at base camp and having to prepare to climb the intensity for that game. I also believe in backloading volume. So if you'll see here, most of our volume sessions are so those would be our higher coaching days, our higher tech tack days where the coaches can, be on the ice really for as long as you want. Those are the furthest points away from the game. So you'll see there's a volume day on December 16th, which is, a week and a half away from our first tournament game, but it's also 2 days before our first exhibition game. And then we have another one December 21st, because we're now 6 days out from our first game. And that would be our really last kind of power practice or high volume day. And then, we'll install things along the way. One of the important things is then I need to be ready to adjust. And this, what happened with this tournament this year is, I'd go in and talk with our coaches about practicing or pregame skating and we made the conscious decision that we weren't going to pregame skate unless we had a day off the day before, but we were going to practice. And so an example of that is December 27th. So we played against the Americans the night before. We were going to practice that next day, but how are we going to practice? Well, at this point, I had 3+ weeks of all of our coaches' drills that I basically sat down and said, how many drills do you guys want to skate them through? Well, and they decided between 3 or 4. So I just ranked our drills from an intensity perspective, high to low, and they were able to pick, using their own drills, what tech-tac outcome they wanted, but still at a high intensity. Our guys are, 3 drills at a high intensity isn't going to have necessarily a negative impact on the next day. It's more or less going to prime them. And we did the same thing on that practice on the 29th after the Russian game. Sat down, loaded up their drills. Okay, guys, what do you want to work from a tech-tac plan? And away you go. So, I had that collaboration with them, which is nice. But because I had measured and monitored and cut all their drills, we were able to feed that information back to them and help their decision-making process on future days. Once you figured out what you want for that day and what kind of your target volume and intensity is from your on ice session, now you need to, what I call work the plan. So for me, I gauge our practices from game intensity. This is using a concept called multi-mechanical modeling that I actually got from watching, there's a presentation on YouTube by Jack Sharkey, who works at Austin Villa. And so he talks about multi-mechanical modeling. I've kind of taken it a little bit of a different step. The concept's still the same, whereas that volume is not a singular metric. So volume isn't just looking at player load for a day or explosive efforts for a day, but combining a few metrics to get a volume-based score. So I look at the average volume for that day compared to our match or our game demands in player load, explosive efforts, and high intensity player load. I have a weighting equation that I use using some principal component analysis, and that allows me to look at player load, explosive efforts, and high intensity player load to give me a volume score. So I can say today's volume was 44% of a game, and then similar to intensity, again, using that principal component analysis, we've narrowed it down to these 5 key metrics, and that gives us a global score of our intensity for that day. So then it's just a matter of, did we hit that? And one of the things I try to provide to our coaches is context. So I show them that, here's our daily fluctuation across our preparation phase leading into the World Championships. And I'm not going to steal Pierre's thunder, but I think his paper that came out a few months ago, looking at, match day -4 all the way to a match day, and how little fluctuation in volume there actually was in ice hockey. And that's not a surprise to those of us that work in the sport. But, I challenge our coaches to not do the same thing every day. And here in these medium grade bars, we fluctuated that external load as we went through the tournament, which was ultimately kind of one of the key outcomes that I had kind of wanted our coaches to start to understand. Again, a key to involve the players. This is a simple report we would post in the dressing room after every practice. So one of the things I look at is a metric called high intensity work duration, which is time spent above player load band 3. And I want to challenge our players, especially from an intensity perspective, is to accumulate as much intensity as possible. Maximize the preparation time that we have to put yourself in the best position when we need that intensity in games. And a quick story about this. So we would post this, we explained to the players what it was and how they could do it. One of our top players, the first time we did it, the first few practices, he was down in the bottom half of this list. As soon as we started to post it, he was never out of the top 3 again. And so a lot of it might just be, they need to see it, that they, compare with your peers. I know, another case is we had our 7th defenseman. He was at the bottom, and I had to explain to him, that was out of his control. He's just not getting the reps in practice to be able to accumulate high intensity work. but as a elite athlete and someone who is very internally driven, he would make sure that the time spent after practice was him doing extra skating drills by himself to make sure he didn't see his name at the bottom. So, I loved working with that player. He took it upon himself that he didn't want to see his name at the bottom outside of, the time he was getting in repetition in practice and drills. And he just wanted to make sure he was still accumulating that high intensity. By the end of our tournament, he was no longer our seventh defenseman. He had worked his way up the lineup. And a lot of that, I think, is just because he, is a phenomenal athlete, but he was able to put himself in a position to succeed because he was that driven. And, he took every opportunity to work hard. The last thing is, being able to interpret, analyze, and summarize the information that comes in. So here's one of the things that I use to look at how our individual players are tracking as a group. I like to use matrix. So this is a concept from a paper that I got by Tim Gabbett and colleagues titled The Athlete Monitoring Cycle, a practical guide to interpreting and applying training monitoring data. I would recommend anybody who's figuring out or trying to figure out how they're going to put all this information together to read that article. It essentially what you're looking at here is on an individual player basis, the change in, so it's a Z score, the change in external load on the x-axis and internal load change on the y-axis. So as they start to get high into their external load, are we seeing a subsequent change in their internal load? And the internal load that I've used here is heart rate trimp. One of the nice parts that we've seen over time is we've actually been able to flag some athletes, for a sickness or an early onset of kind of flu-like symptoms because their external load was dropping. So they were doing less work than normal, but they were seeing a higher internal load. So the internal cost of doing that work was going up. And so we've been able to kind of send some of our athletes to our doctor or our medical team. And really we've used this to guide our both our return to play and our scratched or lower volume players because we want them to stay with the cloud. I really try not to see outliers on here. Here you can see this number 20. They just weren't playing that much. So we needed to use that information to drive some extra work at practice the next day. So just a few key summaries here, and hopefully you've been able to take away some of that information about, how we've been able to use that external load and that intensity, more importantly, to drive our decision-making process. Really, the biggest success that I've had, so with Hockey Canada, every year we get a new coaching group, and we have to essentially start from zero, but I can, show the information we've learned. It's up to the coach to figure out how they're going to best utilize this information. But by showing them, what sessions they're running and providing some of the suggestions as a, practitioner or kind of a domain expert, you hope that everyone is on the same page and moving forward. And maybe that's a pipe dream, that I have, and I've just been really fortunate. But, I always find that showing them the information and anchoring it within their language is the easiest and fastest way to get success. And then lastly, share the data. I've seen a lot of monitoring programs from colleagues, fail or falter because they haven't figured out the best way to show it, whether that's through visuals, open talking, open sharing, but share it to everybody. My nightly email goes to all staff members with our reports from the day. That includes management, coaches, our doctor, our therapists. I want everybody to have that information. We post it in the dressing room. I'm always available with my computer to talk to players. We try to get on the forefront, early on, educating our players on why we're monitoring and what we're monitoring, and more importantly, how we're using that information for success for our team and ultimately the organization. That's all I have today. Thank you very much for listening. And as always, reach out. There's my email address. I'm fairly active on Twitter. So if you want to reach out, please feel free, hit me up. and then Cal, I'll throw it back to you for some of the Q&A.
Great. Appreciate the presentation there, Adam. I've got a few questions that are coming in here. When you were talking about the high intensity section of drills, one of the questions that came through is, what are some of those drills that you're doing that are the highest intensity?
That's certainly a question I could follow up on. Coaches have various nomenclature names for their drills. So, like, for example, with our men's Olympic team, I know our highest intensity drill with that coaching staff, with Willie Desjardins, was the drill he calls 6-shooter. And it's essentially 30 seconds of nonstop, in zone, low zone play, to then a full, 200-meter skate down to another low zone, in zone play, with some cycling. So it's all different. The Hartley warm-up was one our coaching staff used this year to kind of push some of that intensity. And it's essentially a tracking drill. So they have to, find the players in the offensive zone or D zone, and then track back down the ice and have some sort of in-zone play.
Gotcha. Great. And another question that came up is when you were talking about the asymmetries in the beginning of the presentation. One of the questions came from Robert and said, with players coming off surgery, whether it be post-hip or knee surgery, how are you monitoring? What are you doing? Are you controlling the number of strides allowed, average force per stride? What's the skating protocol there for return to play or return to skate?
I know Pierre's going to be talking a lot about the return to play in his presentation, but I will talk about how we've used it in one of our cases. So we use two different things. So we use the player's, pre-injury asymmetry marker. In Catapult terminology, that's our skating load ratio. And so we knew that this player had a +4, meaning he was right side dominant, and that was his norm. And so now when he started skating, he was almost up to like, -28 on the other side. So we needed to work him back to that +4. And what we did is we've used a few different things. We use obviously the skating load ratio as a monitor of getting him back towards his, functional asymmetry. We use our volume of work. But one of the key kind of key performance indicators in that return to play was our percentage of high force strides. We wanted to be confident that this athlete could have an output of his highest intensity without any fear of re-injuring. So we just took that positional norm of his percent high force strides and kind of scaled back, just had a simple, load progression. My background is strength and conditioning. So we just used like a simple linear periodization plan with, kind of breaks or lighter days mixed in. And then we monitored the response, both objectively with our doctor and our medical group, and then would kind of follow that plan as best we could, knowing there's some, potential setbacks along the way.
Definitely. And then one of the questions that came through from Mark is, with a 6-week tournament period being very condensed in looking at high intensity work duration, how are you looking at the cognitive fatigue, looking at, mental stress that they're experiencing and measuring that against the physical performance?
So that is all part of our overall monitoring program. So for us, we do a morning HRV. So we use the app HRV for training, simple 60-second finger scan on using their iPhone. And then they have a 6-question wellness survey that they answer within that app. And then that information gets fed back to me every morning. I sit down and I look at that with our mental performance consultant that works with our team. Him and I really dial in on the sleep questionnaires. Obviously, sleep in a short-term competition is one of our biggest key performance indicators. So we really hone on to, how is each individual player's sleep quality and what's their trend, and are they deviating from that trend? But then he's also put in some questions around some of that kind of cognitive load, how fatigued do they feel is a simple one. Are you mentally prepared to play today? And so we look at all of that and feed that into what my overall, I just call it my performance dashboard. Him and I are the only ones that see that performance dashboard and the visuals on there. And then we filter that information first to our players. So if there's any players we need to talk to, him or I will decide who's the best person to talk to. And then our strategy is going from there on how we can help combat some of that. And then we also feed that information back to our coaches and management, just from a transparency perspective.
Gotcha. And a follow-up question to that is, how are you using that data to make adjustments in nutrition?
Make adjustments within nutrition.
Yeah.
One of the things that we've, experimented with based off some of that HRV is, dosing, more carbohydrate with our guys. We're fortunate enough that we have a lot of control when we're in tournaments. We live in hotels as a team, and we can control the food that gets out, and there's no shortage of that. We try to, put our players in the best position to succeed, even from our supplementation. So whether that's, the beet juice with the nitrate, we've got a great relationship with Gatorade. So we do sweat and hydration testing as well. So we've been able to, kind of educate our players throughout the course of their time with Hockey Canada, kind of surrounding that nutrition. But, it's all part of that, global athlete preparation to performance area.
Gotcha. And then another one that came through was, what differences are you noticing from men versus women in practices and game loads? How do the models differ in different styles?
Obviously, from a physiological perspective, their outputs are not as high as the men. The interesting part is the game of hockey is, relatively the same. We typically kind of downscale our player load banding a little bit, but ratios are still the same. They obviously don't accumulate as much high intensity player load as the men do. I haven't done the principal component analysis for our women's data this year because the Women's World Championship tournament got canceled. So we actually didn't need to do that. In the past, we've anchored things off player load, but we're really looking forward to doing some of that actioning off the kind of the multi-mechanical modeling for the team this year. But they canceled the tournament. So I haven't run those numbers yet. It's on the to-do list. I'm going to imagine it's fairly similar. The paper that I wrote listed down here, the on-ice measures of external load in relation to match outcome. Those also showed that intensity matters, and that was using our women's data. So there's some key metrics that were highlighted in that paper that showed a stronger indication of winning and losing.
Okay, awesome. And time for one more question here is, obviously you having exposure to multiple NHL teams and hockey teams and being a part of one yourself, with the introduction of Clear Sky and positional data, do you see the trend of managing volume more towards player load or more towards distance as now that metric suite is available?
I think along with, a lot of other sports have shown that distance, like a total distance metric, is a little bit of a fallacy, or I think it will be good for broadcast, but not necessarily good for performance practitioners. The example I always use when people ask that is LeBron James. I think it was 2 years ago in the playoffs, it came out saying LeBron's, he's old, he's not covering the same distance as he was when he was younger and playing the sport. But, if you look at his point production in the elite level, he's still the best player in basketball. He's just, found better ways and different ways to move across the court and be successful. I think from a monitoring perspective, I think distance covered at certain speeds is highly valuable, and being able to track that. And again, it's less about comparing player A and player B, but more about comparing what's player A's normal distance at his top speed, and how can we best make sure we're consistently hitting that and dosing that out to him, versus comparing him player A to player B.
Perfect. Well, I appreciate your time today, Adam. Thank you for the presentation. And as a reminder for the audience, we will be posting this recording to our Catapult community website by probably tomorrow. So look out for that.
And Cal, no problem. Just to everybody else, if we didn't get a chance to answer your question, feel free to hit me up offline, and more than happy to chat further.
Great. Thanks for your time today, Adam.
Thank you.
So next up, we have Pierre Allard. He's with the Montreal Canadiens. He's been there now for 10 seasons. 7 of those have been as a strength coach, 3 of those as a director of sports science in the performance department. He holds a master's degree in kinesiology and currently a PhD student at the University of Montreal, where he is researching external load in ice hockey using IMUs. Pierre holds Canadian and French nationalities, former ice hockey player in France and England, so he understands not only how to talk about the data and apply it, but also how the athletes are interpreting that information. So he has a great deal of experience. He's going to be sharing today how in-season training load, injury prevention, and return to play, how he's using that data to implement in these models. So thank you, Pierre, and welcome.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Adam, for your presentation. I hope everybody's healthy and safe at the moment. And I would like to thank Catapult for organizing this event. I think it's a good way to share information and to make sure that we can communicate with the strength and conditioning and the practitioner community. So thanks a lot. So today I'm really excited to present what we do in Montreal, our department, and our work on a day-to-day basis. So basically, this is what I'm going to show today. A little bit of background. The department, the Montreal Canadiens department. How did we start the sports science and performance department? What type of research we've done, and mostly how we use the data, Adam's research as well, to how do we use it in a day-to-day or return to play, or making sure our players are performing at their best. So just a little bit of background as a player. I played junior in the Q with the Saint-Hyacinthe Laser, Cataracts and Chicoutimi. Then I moved to Europe. I played 10 years in Europe, 5 in France and 5 in England for the Manchester Storm. While I was in Europe, I hold a French nationality as well. So I had the privilege to play for the national team, where I did the 5 World Championship with them and the Olympic Games in Nagano. And I remember at that time there wasn't that much strength and conditioning going on, and that was my first experience with the national team, having a strength and conditioning coach. And this is where really I realized this is what I wanted to do after my career. So in 2003, I decided to retire from hockey or from elite sports and go back to school. So I went back at the Montreal University, where I studied my kinesiology there. During that time, I worked for a midget AAA team in Saint-Hyacinthe called les Gaulois. And after that, I met Clément Jaudoin, and I had the privilege to work with him with the Oceanic of Rimouski. So it was great. We had the Memorial Cup there that year, and it was a great experience. So following that, I had a chance to meet with the Montreal Canadiens organization. They were looking for a strength and conditioning coach, and so I got the job. I got to start there. And at the beginning, the first thing I noticed is I was kind of just a one-man band where I had to do everything to cover the strength and conditioning, going on the ice with the players. And there's one thing I've always been curious, and I wanted to see how it feels to do long distance coming from high intensity sport. So I decided to try to do an Ironman. So I worked hard to learn the sports. What I learned mostly is how do you need to fuel your body to make sure that you're capable of doing the distance. So that helps me a lot in my training with the guys, and I would try to get involved in Montreal with the players. Were really present on the field and on the ice, and we follow the players from the most part, like from the gym up to the ice, making sure they're healthy. And on the return to play too, we're spending a lot of time with the players on every steps. So. Well, after 4 or 5 seasons with the Montreal Canadiens as a strength and conditioning coach, the first thing I had a meeting with Marc Bergevin, and we wanted to create a sports science department to make sure that we're on the same page with our farm team in Laval now with the Rocket. And the first thing it was to make sure that we gather all the information together, and we're able to share our resources within the organization. So Laval and Montreal, it's really close. It's less than 20 kilometers apart. So it's really easy to share our resources within the organization. So we decided that we needed to restructure a little bit the strength and conditioning side and be more efficient. So this is our sports science and performance organigram or staff, and the whole idea was to have another help in the team. So we hired Patrick Deliro as strength and conditioning coach. We got Stefano Lani in Laval, but also the most important part for us was to have a connection with the University of Montreal. First thing, we got Jonathan Tremblay. He's kind of a mentor for us. So when there's research coming up, or we wanna ask questions, we get that opportunity, and that comes from you see that kind of structure in Europe, in Australia as well. So we adapt that model to more North American style, and having Jonathan with us, that allowed us to have internship program. We're doing research. We had at some point 3 master degree research and 2 PhD research going on different type of question that we had. So our challenge every day is to make sure that we keep the player on the ice and they stay healthy and they're able to perform. So we got different people working within the structure, and we got David Scott, Martin Fréchette as a sport nutritionist, and recently we hired Romain Martinez as a data scientist who worked with the data for us, try to make sense of everything that we collect. And we got Simon in Laval. We used he's the one in charge of the Catapult and taking care of the prospect and junior and Euros for us. So when we start the sports science and performance department, this is the first thing. I know it's crowded there, but this is the first thing I wanted to make sure is to create links with every aspect of our environment. We had the management, the coaches, the medical staff, the strength and conditioning coach, the players. So this is the challenge that we put together. So making sure we gather all the information, we put it in one place, and we're able to be fast and communicate as fast as possible with the coaches for many aspects in their in the decision-making process. So how we communicate the information, or how the information is shared in the structure. And this is a really interesting book that I read. It's called Team of Teams, and it written by the General McChrystal, who worked in Iraq and Afghanistan. When he arrived there, he realized that on the field everything was going more fast the way they could process communication. And that's a little bit how I felt when I arrived in Montreal. It was more like a background of command. You get someone on top and everybody's got their own department and you share information, and it's a really slow process. And then we moved to a command of teams where the information was still going on really well, faster a little bit, but we needed to integrate everybody within the structure. So I can say that for the past 4 years, we moved to a team of teams where we got everybody involved. And when I say everybody is, we got, well, the athletic therapist, we got one athletic therapist that is communicate with us. He's working in a gym. He's the one who's making the link between the clinic and the gym, and then we can take over for return to play after that. So that part, it's going very fast to communicate within the medical department. Then very early in the reconditioning or return to play phase, we involve the coaches or the assistant coach. We got Luke Richardson, Dominique Duchamp, Kurt Muller. We share the information on the progress of the player, and we get them involved as fast as possible so the players feel like we're communicating all together. And that approach takes time. It takes a lot of trust within the staff and everybody, but we're trying to get everybody involved and making sure we're able to share information. So if Coach Julien comes in the gym and I'm not there, then Patrick can just take over and he's got the information and he can communicate with the coach. So I don't have to be there all the time, but just making sure all the information is shared with everybody. And I'm going to show a little bit how we do that as well. When we started the department, the first thing was that I showed the team was the cost of injury. And there's a really good research of Donaldson for that was done in 2014. And it shows that the cost of injury, it's over $8 million, about $8 million per team per year, which is separate into half of that is trauma. That there's nothing that you can do about that. But the other half is things that probably you can work on and be better and try to save money for the team. But the cost of injury, it's not always a term of money for our coach, Coach Julien. For him, is maybe you lose your best player in the team. That's a big cost in terms of wins. After that, you get the medical staff. You're just adding more pressure to the medical staff. They already got a big schedule, so it's tough to put extra time that you got to work with players. And same thing in the gym, it's extra time that we got to spend with an injured player and making sure he's returning to play. So that put a lot of pressure, not only on the financial aspect, but also on the staff and coaches. Just an example of our last month of December. So you see how the big challenge of a busy schedule. Well, the NHL season, it's 26 weeks, 82 games. We got 4 days off per month that we need to schedule, 1 week off per year, the bye week, and 3 days at Christmas. So that leaves a lot of games, a lot of practices, and a little bit like General McChrystal in his book, things are going really fast because you finish a practice sometimes an hour and a half after you're in the plane going somewhere. So that this is why the communication needs to be very good within the organization. There's one thing I like from that statement from James Arrington is, for us, we needed a tool to make sure that we measure things, that we understand it, and how can we control it. And this is where we turn ourselves to Catapult, and we bought the system. And one thing when we done our research was to to make sure how we can use it to be more efficient especially on the return to play for the players. So I'm just going to go quickly because Adam put a lot of info in his presentation, but for us using the Catapult in our research, we used all 50 players, and I know for some of the people, 50 players, it's a lot, but the American League reality, there's a lot of players going up and down and being called up from the East Coast Hockey League. And so it was a total of 50 players who participate to our study. It lasts for 28 weeks. Well, we cover all 76 games and all practices. So it was a total of over 3,000 individual sessions. So all the players for all the sessions. We divide into 3 groups: defenseman, winger, center. Goalie, they were excluded from the research. And we separate the practices into match day -4, 3, 2, 1, and match day -0 was the morning skate. So at first we look at the player load, but we realized that the on-ice load was better for us and the on-ice load per minute for intensity. So what we saw is during games, for the on-ice load, it's pretty, for every position, it's pretty stable. Everybody is about the same. There's a significant difference for defensemen in terms of intensity for the game. It's a little bit lower than the winger and the center. If we go relative to games, first period compared to second and third period, everybody is more like active in the first period compared to the second and the third. Also for intensity, there's a little bit lower intensity in a third period for all groups. In terms of practices, we look at practices, and well, obviously for match day in the morning skate, the volume of the practice is lower. Also, the intensity is lower. But one thing we notice is for every practices, the defensemen, they get for them it's easier to reach a game-like intensity, and one of the reasons for that is defensemen, they don't move as much as players. They're more static on the blue line, and sometimes they're gonna cruise a little bit going up in a neutral zone. So for defensemen, it's whatever the situation, it's easier to reach a game-like intensity. So that's a good thing to learn. Also, last thing for the research is we noticed that for every week in the season, there's no significant difference in terms of volume of training. So basically, when a team play less, they practice more, and so that's something that we notice. The other thing that we notice is the morning skates involve a training load of about 34% of a match. If we add up all the morning skates that the player done that year, it was kind of adding 12 extra games to the season. So it's quite a lot, and this is why we try to tell the coaches that sometimes when you get a busy schedule like we saw for the month of December, it's tough to add up 12 games to your season just with your morning skate. And most of the time, the training load that we see with the Catapult units, so they're coming from extra work that the players would do after practice or after the morning skate. They will stay an extra 20 minutes. That will add up a lot of training load to their average. So the practical application with that was to individualization of the training, and I think that's that's the best thing for us that we saw is when we take the information that Adam mentioned it in his presentation, and you individualize your approach with the player, and you look at the player's data. And our job is not to compare one player to another, but what is the player is giving you on the ice, establish a baseline with the players to work better with him. And that's what we tell the player at the beginning of the year. We say, work with us when you're healthy, guys, and you're practicing and you're playing. Give us the data. We need that data. So when you need us, we're going to be there and try to bring you back into the action as fast as possible. Also, it helps coaches to include more intensity in their exercise, similar to the game like situations. What we noticed too is for wingers, it's tougher to gain game-like intensity because of the nature of their work. It's battling in the corners, back checking, working in front of the net, and it's tough to replicate that during practices because that involved a lot of work for them, and also you get a high risk of injury when you do a lot of battles during practices. So we do live monitoring with the players. So we stand beside the ice and we give like instant feedback to coach and to players during practice, and especially on a return to play too. It's really efficient. So for the return to play scenario with the player, this is a good, nice research that I read from Blanche, and there's Tim Gabbett involved in too as well. And it shows that there's 3 steps into your decision-based model for return to play. And so basically the doctor evaluate the players, you evaluate the risk. And this is where I think it's the key there. The decision modification, and that's the biggest challenge, especially for pro sports. This is where the communication is the key within every department. And there's there's a lot of pressure for a player to return to play. So the communication, it's really important. You need to eliminate the emotion factor in your decision-making process. And sometimes it's tough because we had a situation in the past where you get a player that if he returns to play earlier, he's going to play his 500 games in the NHL, and it would be in front of his family in Toronto. So this is the emotion factor that sometimes you need to understand the situation, but you need to act like I'm in control. I get objective data, and we're going to work with that. And this is where you got to turn your attention to more objective data with the player. And so to do that, in order to do that, you got to keep the player involved in the return to play process. And that's sometimes at the beginning, it was something that we noticed that we had to be better at, and making sure the player were involved as well as fast as possible. And so what we looked at is the demand on the player. What type of player it is, what is he doing during a game, and what can we show the players so to turn the focus from, okay, I want to return in 3 weeks, to this is what I need to do in order to return to play. So based on Adam's research, we got Dr. Montgomery too at the University McGill, who done a pretty good paper as well. And you got Lionel too, use IMU to measure game load. So we look at, let's say we got a defenseman is injured, so he's one of your most active defensemen in your team. So he's playing a lot of minutes, 25 to 30 minutes per game. So what Montgomery tell us is, for forward and backward skating, the number of events in terms of start, stop, crossovers, sharp turn, you get the total hits as well. And from from the Catapult and any IMU you can use. You get your on ice load, you get the number of sprints too in a high intensity. And this is where it's pretty interesting to work with the distance. And Adam spoke to in his presentation about the distance. So it's very useful for us to work with the number of sprints the players get to do in a high intensity and to cover his distance that he would need to do during a game. So this is where you can use the objective data to work with the players. So we show the player what he needs to do in order to come back and get back to play. So we change the focus, and now we're working more with the data. And what we saw is the player right after practice, they would come in our office, or if we're on the bench, they would come right away to the screen and see what he'd done that day. Another thing is that we forget a lot, I would say, in a return to play. It's the well, how many puck battles you do during a game. And Montgomery in his research shows that if, let's say, for a most active player, for a defenseman, it was 25. So you got to make sure your player is capable of doing that amount of work before he's back into a practice or he's back to play. So during the return to play, we got a rule that I got from Graham Reinben, our athletic therapist, and that's what they do in the clinic or in the gym when they work with a player. They always do 2 days with the same training volume or the same intensity, and then they move on after that to upgrade a little bit the program or change or adapt things. So we want to make sure that the player had time to recover from the training session that you gave him or the on-ice session, making sure in his progression it's going well. And then you can, after 2 days without anything in particularly, you want to move on and add up things after that. So that's one rule that I think the whole department are using together, is making sure the players are capable of doing 2 times the same session, and then you upgrade the training. And what we use to measure if we're in the right direction. So we use the one of the research of Peter Blanche. Again, it's well, the acute chronic. I know there's a lot of things right now about the acute chronic, but this is how we use it. So we get a player that for the past 4 years, for 4 weeks, he's got 100%, the training volume, he's playing games, and then there's an injury coming up. So you ramp things up, and you accumulate 4 weeks of training, which is 30% of his maximum during the time that he was full go and LT at the moment. And then suddenly on week 5, you add up 90% of a normal week for him. So you put him more at risk of injury. So if you look at the graph here, it's 46% likelihood of injury. I know it's not like perfect science, but we use it as a guideline for us to say, okay, are we heading in the right direction? Is it too much? And this, you can use it with anything that you collect for data. You can use it for session RPE. This is a little bit of how we gather the information. We do most of our RPE ourselves, Patrick and I. We collect all the data for the duration of practice based on the Catapult data, the game, what they do in the gym, and then we ask the player their RPE. We got certain players that communicate the information for us, so that helps a lot. So how do we use that data after? Is I would create some graph to Patrick to tell him, okay, well, this is the in the arbitrary units, the game, the gym, and the practices load for the week. And there's one thing there, and I put that on the sheet to show you that this is sometimes it would happen like that if you don't monitor your player well, and so you get a player that is going, you know, full season, everything's going well, then gets injured in November 18, doesn't during that week doesn't do anything, then you start ramping things up, and this is what happened when you ramp things up too quickly. A lot of gym right away, right in this standard deviation, and then you add up ice time and going on the ice with the players and ice and gym, and boom, after 3 weeks he's back, and he needs to sit back a little bit and start moving up. Then you see the second time, this is why I put it that way for you. The second time it was done more with a progression and 3 weeks of work with a hard week at the end, and then 1 week of rest in the January 20th week, and then 3 weeks of hard work, and then back to play, back to normal. So this is more like a normal progression that you would see, and this is why Catapult and all the data that you collect can help you doing that. So on the field, let's say we get early stage of rehab. So in our gym, we try with Patrick to get the player involved, even if it's minimum what they have to do. We're going to get the player involved and make sure that we keep working with them for whatever we're allowed to do, or the therapists tell us that we could do. So we're gonna get the player right away, trying to get him back into the gym, into action. Same thing on the early stage. We want to do a little bit of ballistic movement. So we get the player again with whatever we're allowed to do, and this is where the communication with the athletic therapist and the medical staff, it's really important. So I show just a few movement. I'm sure all the strength and conditioning coaches got a lot of imagination, and they're able to build program for the player. And then we move to the return to train movement, and this is where we add up movement of eccentric and concentric movement. We make sure the player is ready to move to the ice eventually, and being able to load and to change direction. So we get the player involved into movement of concentric and eccentric movement. Then on the same return to train phases, we get the player involved in more complex movement, where he's got to do multiple action at the same time, using his core and using a sled, and making sure we get him engaged. And this is where you can work on good technique of the movement and challenge the player a little bit. Then we move to the return to play average match demands. And this is how I see it a little bit. So you've been working in solo with a player, and you've been trying to build them up and ready to come back into action. And then you got to throw him into the real world, where there is a little bit of chaos, and everything's going everywhere. So this is the most important phase for me, and this is where everything can potentially go wrong, because you got a lot of things that get involved. A player is getting anxious to return to play, going on the road, practicing with the team. So this is where your communication with the staff and with everybody, it's really important. And Claude Julien, our coach, is really good for us on that. Our team policy is if the player is not able to follow the NHL pace, then is not returning and practice with the team. And this is where, like Adam was saying, that we need to show, report to the coaches and say, okay, well, we cover everything that we needed to cover. We got hits, we got sprints. This is the amount of sprints he's been doing, the battles. So this is why we keep track of everything. So when it comes down to talk with the coach, and even if there's a lot of pressure for the players to return, we want to make sure as a team that we take the best decision for the player and for the team. So we need to have the same message And I remember at the beginning, when I started 10 years ago, sometimes a coach will met the injured player in the coffee room, and they start talking, and the player say, well, I think I'm ready to come back. And then that just create confusion. Then the coach wants to know why the player is saying that he's going to be back, and you guys telling me that it's going to be in 2-3 weeks. So we want to avoid that. That's why we try to gather as much information and being able to share that information. So back to training, when we start the return to play average match demands phase, we include more complex movement into ballistic movement. So now we want the player to be able to train and to load and to toss balls on the ice. We start, similar to in the gym, we start with very simple movement, loading and pushing. So we want to make sure the players get back into the type of movement, like skating is way different than running and jumping. So we want to make sure the player is able to return after that. Same thing, we add up after more complex movement. We see for defensemen the loading phase, especially when you skate backward and gaining some speed. So we will vary in terms of slow movement and fast movement with the player, and then eventually go back to more complex drills with pucks and shooting. And this is where we're gonna add up battles also in a corner with all the players, and so get the player involved into more match or game situation. And this take us back to the first sheet that I show you. With it's important to keep that in mind with the player and to show him the progression. And this is what we do. We try to make sure the player is with us in the process, and we show him every week what he needs to accomplish during that week, and eventually bring it to like a game situation where you can cover all aspect of what he would see on ice during a game. And I'm just going to finish with that here. I've got on the return to peak performance, this is where we take the player back into like a full go and full body contact. And we use our staff, we got Patrick and myself going on the ice with the players, and we use padding to make sure that the player can control the body check first and he's comfortable, and we make him feel like, okay, well, I can start slowly to hit, to battle in a corner. So we use a blue mat. But when you get a guy like Shea Weber, who's been a full year without playing, and then he cover everything that you need to do and battle in the corner, and he's ready to hit now. So I got a little clip that shows that when Shea is ready to return to play, he want to let you know as well. So we got Pat in a corner, and he took the hit for the whole team. So I want to thank Patrick for taking care. I work with him every day, and he take the return to play to heart with the players, and so he's really willing to sacrifice himself in order for the player to come back to play. So I want to thank everybody to listening, and this is the information about the books that I use also for the presentation. There's also a podcast with Basic Performance Against the Rules that I like a lot. You can do courses on Udemy, so there's a lot of things you can do during that time off. Also, this is my email if you need to contact me, and if you want to get our research, you can contact on ResearchGate, and I will share all the information with you guys. So thanks a lot for listening, and I'm ready for a question.
Thanks, Pierre. I appreciate the presentation and your time today. A few questions that have come up is with the aspect of monitoring with the professional team. How have you found the daily workload to be in terms of recording, editing, analyzing? What are some practical constraints you've had to adapt around, given the fact that you're probably wearing multiple hats?
Yeah, I think that's really a good question. There's a lot of things that we would like to do with the team, and this is where we're not using a lot of technology. We use GymAware, we use force plates data. So what we collect for information, or what we gather together, we're trying to make sure that we get time to do it. And this is why we got that link with the Montreal University. So we got the internship program that allowed us to have students with us working, and that's really helpful. And we had a lot of students in the past working with us, and they can help Patrick in the gym, and they can help me in doing all the gathering all the info and sharing the info. But with Roman Martinez, our data analytic department, we're able to be fast on report. We want to make sure that as soon the practice is over, we can communicate the information as fast as possible. But students are really important for us. This is why our link, we got that link with the Montreal University.
Definitely. And with the game data, right? Were you capturing some of that with the Catapult devices? And to follow up on that question, with the incoming tracking data from the NHL, how do you see that, complementing what you're doing now?
Yeah, that for us, that's going to be a big change for all the NHL teams, and I think having all the information from the positional data for practices over the past couple of years, and when you can compare to the NHL data that we're going to get in the future, that's going to be for us very important, because we're going to be more efficient, I think, on the return to play for sure, and getting more objective data to share with the player and the staff, and also during just monitoring the practice for coaches. We'll be able to say, okay, well, this is what you cover compared to a very intense game that you had a couple of weeks ago. So I think that will help to communicate more information, like Adam was saying, to the coaches.
Definitely. And with that in mind, obviously more data and more decisions or more data to make better decisions, right? How often do you feel that the coaches are making decisions based off of feeling, knowing that the mentality is slowly changing to use data to be able to make better decisions?
Well, I think the communication with the coaches, that's an important part. Adam mentioned a little bit in his presentation, and I think coaches are more and more open to new technology. I mean, for us, we've been 4 years now with Catapult, and every year we feel like we're moving forward, and the coaches are sharing feedbacks to us, and they want to know, and they want to make sure they cover how was their practice, and could they change something, and especially in the NHL, we got with the LT scratches, we can be more efficient too, and this is where we get the assistant coach involved in the process. So when they skate players, I don't go and tell assistant coach, this is the practice I want you to run for that player. I would go to him and say, look, we need today we need 20 sprints, and we need battle in the corners. So you're the professional, you're the one who's designing drills, but when you design those drills, can you take in consideration that this is what we need in order to keep the player going and making sure he's ready to go back to play? And also on the LT scratches, what we noticed at the beginning with the data from Catapult is some of the LT scratch were working way too hard. They were doing a lot of ice, a lot of gym, and being able to show the player that, look, if you do that when you're gonna when the coach is going to ask you to jump in the play or in the action, you're going to be dead tired. So this is where we we can use the data and say, okay, well, we need to lower what you do on the ice, be more efficient, and work on game-like situations. So when you jump in the action, you're ready.
Definitely. And from a return to play protocol, got a few questions on this and are you looking at weight? Are you looking at maximal skating speed? If you're looking at maximum skating speed, as you pointed out, how much emphasis are you putting on that versus other variables?
I think, well, the players, they like to see their player load, their on ice load, their intensity. I think they've been show that at the beginning, and that's a way they talk with each other. But for us on the strength and conditioning on the sports science side, we will look at the amount of sprints the players is doing and the speed that he's gaining, and the average high intensity sprints speed they're going. So that gives us more information. And if we can bring a player capable of sprinting on the ice at the same pace that he's doing in games, then that's where we win. And that's why I always tell the players, for me, ice hockey player, it's an on-ice sprinter. And the capacity to repeat sprints, this is where you're going to separate good players from excellent players.
Yeah. And how transferring it from the weight room, how much data are you getting from the weight room back onto the ice?
Yeah, we use, force plate data. Every week, players will come and do 3 counter movement jumps, and we always do it in the same environment and same situation where the players are returning from a day off, and it's a practice day. So that will happen maybe up to 15 to 20 times during the season. So we're trying to use the force plates data. We use Gym Aware to monitor the speed of the movement of the bar when they train. So we're going to use that with the players. And the way we put it with the players, we want to detect early if we notice some asymmetry on the force plates, and we relay that information very fast to on the medical side. So and this is where we tell the players too that our job is to keep them on the ice, and we don't want to put them into a break or they need to set back or something like that. But we want to detect things early so we can use the data from Catapult in terms of asymmetry and match it with the force plates data, and then use it on the ice, making sure that the player is aware of what he needs to work and concentrate. But other than that, we use, like I said, the RPE, and you know, we try to use it 100% instead of going everywhere, you know.
And with the RPE, another question that came through is, what scale are you using with the RPE?
What scale? We use the training load, the intensity and the time that they've been working at that for on ice or for so it's really what the players felt during that practice, and we collect all that. It's arbitrary units that we collect and we gather over the weeks, and we just do an average and a standard deviation for the player. We want to keep it very simple, and for us it's just a guideline that helps our strength coaches in Laval and Montreal to make sure that the player have done enough work during that week.
Gotcha. And the final question here is, obviously with the current situation we're all in, how are you kind of training with the athletes remotely, and what tips are you giving them if you can't meet in large groups? How are they staying consistent, knowing that they can't train as a team?
Yeah, it's a challenging situation, I think, for every team right now, because it's kind of unknown. So you get in a position where, well, players had to return home. And what we've done is Patrick and Stefano and Laval, the strength and conditioning coach, they make sure right away they get a communication with the players. And we found that there was 3 different reality for the players. You get players that got nothing, no gym equipment, not access to a gym. They can only use body weight. So our team designed a program for those players. Also, we get players with like just a treadmill and a few dumbbells, maybe a BOSU. So Patrick and Stefano got in touch with the players. They got pictures from their maybe basement, and then they build a training program. And we got a few players that are lucky because they build a gym in their home, so they can get like a full access to a gym. So basically there was like 3 different situations for the players, and we focused on nutrition, on training, but also we include a little bit of plyometrics, so making sure the players are still doing some impact. So if we need to return to play, this is a situation where you get a battle or you get a do contact practice, maybe you're going to be able to catch up faster if you do some plyos and some ballistic movement as well. So we included that, and also we gave them access to a stretching program and to cardio program that they can do either in their house or they go outside and they use an area where they can do short sprints.
Great. Well, Pierre, I really appreciate the presentation and time for questions here, and likewise, Adam. Thank you guys both for jumping on and showing us what you guys are up to. As a reminder for the audience, we will be posting this recording to the Catapult community website. So take have a look, and when that comes out, should be tomorrow. We should tweet about it, and you should get an email notification as well. In addition, we'll have another round of webinars that we'll announce shortly. So stay tuned for those. But again, thank you for everybody for joining, and hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you.